Greetings, everyone. Mr. Hunter here, and welcome to the second part of our three-part series on the three great Renaissance masters, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo Buonarroti, and today's subject, Raffaello Sanzio da Urbino. We will refer to him simply as Raphael from this point forward, and we're going to take a close look at his greatest work, the Stanza della Segnatura, which includes his greatest masterpiece, the fresco known as the School of Athens. The School of Athens and the other works of art in the stanza are large frescoes that are located within the walls of the Vatican, the headquarters of the Catholic Church. So where is this Vatican? Italy? Is it in Rome? The answer to this question is neither. Now, the Vatican isn't in Rome, but it certainly is surrounded by Rome. Unless you have serious connections inside the Vatican, you will most likely have to stay at a hotel or Airbnb in Rome, then take a taxi, bus, moped, walk on over. The Vatican City-State, also known as the Vatican, became independent from Italy with the Lateran Treaty of 1929. The papal conclave itself is a sovereign entity of international law which maintains the city-state's temporal, diplomatic, and spiritual independence. With an area of 121 acres and a population of about 825, it is the smallest state in the world in both size and population. St. Peter's Basilica is the most renowned work of Renaissance architecture and the largest church in the world. It is also the heart and soul of Vatican City. It is literally a work of art inside and out and is decorated and filled with priceless art treasures. Now, the stanza is adjacent to the Sistine Chapel, which is adjacent to St. Peter's. They're all very close to each other physically. And Raphael was commissioned by Pope Julius II to paint the Stanza della Signatura frescoes, which was Pope Julius II's papal library and part of the papal apartments. Here you see a portrait painted by Raphael of Pope Julius II, the warrior pope, which was his nickname. He also had commissioned Michelangelo to do the Sistine Chapel ceiling frescoes and Donato Bramante a few years earlier to design and rebuild the new St. Peter's Basilica. These three projects of great consequence were happening simultaneously. It truly was the high point of the High Renaissance. Now here, walking into the Stanza della Segnatura, as it might look today. Imagine this room with the lower walls lined with books. The stanza included the four large frescoes based on the four branches of human knowledge. In the upper left, we see the School of Athens, which represents philosophy, including science and mathematics, basically all things of this physical world. On the opposite wall from the School of Athens is La Disputa, which represents God and all things divine. The two lower frescoes were on the adjacent walls. They were a little smaller. It's a rectangular shaped room. Lower left was the fresco that focused on justice, and the lower right, poetry and literature. The geometric meander that we see in the arch that frames the School of Athens was inspired by designs found on ancient Greek pottery from around 900 to 700 BCE. Here is an example of that ancient pottery. It's easy to see where Raphael's inspiration for the geometric meander came from. The School of Athens' visual power emanates from the figures in the middle of the composition, the great philosophers Plato and Aristotle. Plato is known for being interested in the ethereal, the theoretical, that which cannot be seen. Aristotle, on the other hand, is more interested in the physical, the actual world that can be observed. As Plato is known for being interested in the ethereal, we also see him emphasizing this with his gestural hand pointing upward towards the sky and the ideal forms. Aristotle, more interested in the physical, we see him gesturing with his outstretched right hand, palm face down, to emphasize the physical down here on earth. Other ways to distinguish the two great philosophers: Plato was older, in fact, Aristotle's teacher, and is also holding his book, the Timaeus. His face was based on and inspired by Leonardo da Vinci's self-portrait. Plato's interest in the ethereal, the theoretical, are symbolized also in the color of his clothing, which is colored red and purple to signify the air and fire, which were both perceived as weightless. Aristotle was younger and is holding one of his books, the Ethics. His interest in the physical and observable is emphasized in his clothing and the colors of it that are blue and brown that represent water and earth, that which is affected by gravity. Now, the composition is divided up into two sides, split right down the middle. This imaginary line that separates Plato's side from Aristotle's side. Plato's side being filled with great thinkers who follow Platonic ideals. On the other side, we have Aristotle and those that were more interested in the physical world, that which could be observed and applied. Take Euclid as a prime example of this particular idea, who we associate with geometry and is actually drawing a geometric diagram for his students in the painting, is interested in precise measurement, the application of math to the world in practical ways through engineering and architecture. In fact, the model for Euclid was Raphael's friend and one of the great architects of the High Renaissance, Donato Bramante. You can see that Bramante's influence on the fresco does not stop with his likeness that inspired the look of Euclid, but Raphael also used Bramante's architectural design ideas to create the setting for the School of Athens to be in. We see his original design for the new St. Peter's, the floor plan for it. And we also see his drawing of the great dome that he was going to build on top of the great church. Now, the inside, Bramante died before he could finish. The task was handed over to Michelangelo to pick up and move forward. But here inside, we can see the coffered barreled vaults, those nice round arch-like vaults in the ceiling leading to the open great dome. On the side walls, we see the pilasters jutting out. Look at the School of Athens fresco. We see these same coffered barrel vaults, the pilasters jutting out from the walls, the open dome in the background. We also see in the niches on either side of the central vaults figurative sculptures in the classical style. On the left, we have Apollo, the god of sun, music, and poetry, and a perfect fit for all things ethereal and Platonic. On the more grounded side, that is Aristotle, and his follower stands Athena, the god of war and wisdom, symbolizing man's more practical nature? Possibly. Euclid has his equally important counterpart on the Platonic side of the gathering. That would be Pythagoras. Pythagoras holds court with his students as he shares his discoveries, laws of harmony in music and mathematics. Or maybe he's just assigning some algebra homework that focuses on solving for c using a right triangle and solving for the hypotenuse, giving that a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Ha ha! As we visit the other side of the composition, we notice there's a group of astronomers adjacent to the Euclidean group. The astronomers are an ancient group of scientists interested in the physical universe. This group is also in part because it includes a portrait of the artist Raphael, taking his place among the great minds focused on stars and planets beyond our own world. This is a very important distinction, as until the Renaissance, artists were considered and looked upon as artisans or craftsmen. Here is Raphael's proof, quite literally, that it takes a great artist to visualize and synthesize all other aspects of human thought. We have two solitary figures in the central area of the fresco. On the right, we have Diogenes, the most famous homeless man in ancient history. Diogenes was a cynic and a philosopher who was skeptical of all philosophies. Raphael renders Diogenes as barefoot and half naked. In his relation to the king next to him, he displays indifference, proving that he is unmoved by status, wealth, or royal connections. In fact, he objects to Alexander, whose shadow is blocking the sunlight that he was reading by. Raphael used the image of Michelangelo as inspiration for a fellow brooding, solitary figure that is the philosopher Heraclitus, who sits in one of the most prominent spots in the whole composition. The School of Athens is based on one-point linear perspective, except for this cube or chunk of marble that Heraclitus uses for a writing table. You will be learning how to draw using 1- and 2-point linear perspective later in the spring, but you get a solid preview of in this diagram over the School of Athens of how linear perspective works. Raphael uses 1-point perspective for the whole composition. You see that vanishing point comes right like a Raphael uses 1-point perspective for the whole. Raphael uses 1-point perspective for the whole composition, except for that chunk of marble that Heraclitus is leaning on. We see the vanishing point for this 1-point perspective right between, like a bullseye, between Plato and Aristotle. that red line that red line cutting across the middle of the composition is the horizon line, which represents the eye level of the viewer. And all parallel lines receding into space find will converge on the horizon line, as you can see in the diagram. You will learn how to use, you will learn, delete. Later in the semester, you'll be learning to draw using 1 and 2 point linear perspective to create a sense of deep illusional space on a two-dimensional surface. Raphael uses 1 point perspective for the whole composition, except for that chunk of marble that Heraclitus is leaning on and taking notes on, which uses 2 point perspective. Raphael sets examples all over this composition of the classical ideal, sharing ideas and knowledge with your fellow man. Knowledge freely shared can be, in some people's eyes, a very dangerous thing, but not in this work and not in this particular time. Thank you, and I look forward to meeting you in the Sistine Chapel next week.